When Burt Reynolds upended a glass of ice water over Johnny Carson's head, the world saw a shocking public insult, but it was actually a desperate 12-word lifeline thrown to a man whose spirit was perishing behind the scenes. Behind that soaking wet suit lay a heartbreaking secret and a hidden message that would finally be revealed decades after the king of late night reached his final horizon. Johnny Carson lived his life in the spotlight, yet he was the most private soul to ever grace the small screen. To millions watching at home, he was our nightly companion, the man who tucked us in with a smile. But behind that mahogany desk, there was a man carrying the weight of the world on shoulders, starting to feel the strain. That evening, as the band played the opening theme, the laughter in the room felt different to those who really knew him. It felt fragile. Ed McMahon felt a sudden, cold shiver of dread. Johnny wasn't just tired. He looked as though he were standing on the edge of a great canyon, wondering if he had the strength to make the leap one more time. The audience, mostly tourists who had waited hours in the sun, didn't see the slight tremor in his hands. They didn't notice how his breath came in shallow bursts as he stood behind the curtain. All they saw was the silhouette of a legend. But for those few who walked the hallways of NBC, the silence from Johnny's dressing room had been deafening. Usually, you'd hear the thrum of drumsticks or the low murmur of writers. Today, there was nothing but the sound of the air conditioning and a sense of profound, crushing isolation. As the announcer shouted those four famous words, "Here's Johnny." The curtain parted, and the king stepped out into the light. He performed the golf swing, gave the practiced grin, and leaned into the microphone with the grace of a pro. But for the first time, the jokes felt like they were coming from 1,000 miles away. He was a ghost of the vibrant entertainer we all loved. Deep in the front row, a woman noticed Johnny wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking through them, searching for someone who could pull him back from the brink. He was a captain trying to steer a ship through a fog so thick he could no longer see the stars. The monologue finished to thunderous applause, but as Johnny walked toward his desk, he didn't offer his usual wink. Instead, he sat down and gripped the edges of the desk so hard his knuckles turned white, realizing the mask he had worn for decades was finally beginning to shatter in front of 20 million people. He looked toward the guest entrance with a plea in his eyes, knowing the man about to walk through those doors was the only person on earth who knew the truth about the heartbreak Johnny was hiding. In the quiet, frantic moments before the countdown, Johnny had done something that broke every rule of his persona. He had reached out and caught Burt Reynolds by the sleeve in the darkened hallway, his fingers trembling with urgency. There was no witty banter in that narrow corridor. There was only a man who felt his life slipping away under the crushing weight of a secret grief no one else was allowed to see. Burt had felt the heat of Johnny's hand through his jacket and stopped mid-stride, the laughter vanishing from his face. He saw a hollowness there, a cavernous sorrow that had been growing since a private phone call earlier that morning had delivered news that would have ended the joy of any lesser man. Johnny's youngest son was facing a crisis no father should ever witness, and the loss of all hope seemed written in the lines of Johnny's forehead. But the machine of late-night television does not stop for a broken heart, and the contract with the public demanded a smile even when the soul was no longer present inside. Johnny had whispered, his voice a ghost, that he didn't think he could make it through the hour. He told Burt the lights felt like fire, and the laughter sounded like a mockery of the calamity waiting back home. Burt didn't offer platitudes. He simply gripped Johnny's hand back with a strength that promised to hold him together. He made a silent vow that he would be the anchor for the man who was usually the anchor for everyone else. As they stood there, the stage manager's voice counted down the seconds, a relentless ticking toward the moment they would have to step out and pretend the world was a kind place. Johnny's breathing was coming in sharp hitches, the sign of a man about to lose his composure. He was terrified the first joke he told would turn into a sob, and that millions would see the undoing of the legend they relied on. Johnny looked at the curtain as if it were a shroud, his feet heavy as lead, and for a heartbeat, it looked as though he might walk out the back door. But Burt leaned in close and whispered that he wouldn't let him drown. They were two men bound by a brotherhood that went beyond cinema, standing on the precipice of a public calamity that only one of them had the power to prevent. As the music swelled and the lights turned brilliant white, Johnny stepped forward into his marks, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He felt the cold sweat beginning to bead at his hairline, a manifestation of the conclusion of his endurance. He sat at that desk feeling like an imposter in his own life, waiting for the one guest who knew that underneath the expensive suit, Johnny Carson was a man whose world had passed away. The monologue that evening was a technical masterpiece. Yet to Burt Reynolds, sitting just behind the curtain, it sounded like the lonely tolling of a bell. To the audience, Johnny was as sharp as ever, tossing out quips about the rising price of gasoline with the charm that had made him the most trusted man in America. But if you watched his eyes, you could see the pilot had left the cockpit. He was operating on instinct, while his heart was miles away in a sterile hospital room where the light was reaching its final glimmer for someone he loved more than life itself. Every time the audience roared, Johnny seemed to flinch, his eyes darting toward the Tonight Show logo as if it were a mocking neon sign. He was performing the ultimate act of sacrifice, putting aside his broken heart to ensure a weary nation could have their hour of peace. It is the heavy burden of the clown to keep the world laughing, even when his will to go on has been extinguished under the pressure of a private ordeal. Burt watched from the wings, his own heart aching as he saw his friend's knuckles turn white. He noticed Johnny's usual pauses were stretching a fraction of a second too long, filled with a suffocating silence that only someone who loved him could hear. The stage lights now seemed to expose every line of exhaustion on Johnny's face, turning the studio into an interrogation room. He was a man drowning in plain sight, surrounded by people who only saw the sparkling surface. Even Ed McMahon felt a lump forming in his throat as he noticed Johnny fumble with his cigarette lighter. A small but jarring mistake. Ed realized the man he called the King was currently a fragile servant to a public that didn't know he was spiritually spent. The contrast was unbearable. The bright colors of the set and the upbeat tempo of the band felt like a cruel joke on a man privately preparing for a final farewell to all his joy. As Johnny finally made his way to the desk, the walk seemed to take a lifetime. He adjusted his blotter, straightened his pencils, performing the familiar rituals that usually gave him comfort, but today they were merely the frantic gestures of a man trying to find his footing. He was trapped in a live broadcast, tied to a chair by expectations, while the misery in his heart threatened to overflow. He knew the moment he stopped talking, the darkness would rush in to fill the void, and he wasn't sure if he had the strength to keep the shadows at bay for another 45 minutes. He looked down at his guest list, his vision blurring for a terrifying second, and saw the name of the man who was waiting in the wings to save him. The red light of the camera glowed like a warning signal, a reminder that there was nowhere to hide. Johnny drew in a breath that felt like swallowing broken glass, his fingers hovering over a small photograph of his son hidden behind his script, realizing the next guest was the only thing standing between him and a soul-shaking collapse on national television. Burt Reynolds stepped through those famous curtains, not with the swagger of a movie star, but with the quiet intensity of a soldier going back into the fire to rescue a fallen brother. The audience erupted into a wall of sound, a standing ovation that shook the foundations, but Burt didn't even acknowledge the cheers. His eyes were locked onto Johnny's, scanning that familiar face and seeing the hairline fractures in the mask of the King. He could see that Johnny was swaying internally, a man who had reached the absolute end of his tether and was now just staring into the abyss while trying to remember his lines. As Burt settled into the guest chair, he didn't lean back. Instead, he leaned forward, closing the distance between himself and the man behind the desk. He began to talk, spinning a yarn about a car chase on a movie set, but his words were secondary to the message he was sending with his presence. Every time Johnny laughed, a dry sound, Burt would look at him with a piercing gaze that said, "I am right here." The banter was there, the quick-witted exchanges were present, but there was a subtext to their conversation that felt like a secret code. Burt was purposefully taking up space, doing the heavy lifting, allowing Johnny a few precious seconds to simply breathe without the pressure of being the center of the universe. To anyone else, it looked like two titans sharing a moment of gold. But to the people sitting in that studio who knew the truth, it was a rescue mission. Burt noticed a small photograph of Johnny's family on the desk, a piece of home that Johnny had brought out for the first time in years, and he realized just how close to the shattering of his heart Johnny actually was. The host was clutching a pencil so tightly it looked as though the wood might snap, his eyes darting toward the commercial clock with a look of pure panic. He was a man drowning in a sea of applause, and Burt was the only one who had brought a life vest to the set that night. The dialogue between them started to drift, becoming less about Hollywood and more about things that truly mattered: loyalty, the passing of those we cherish, and the courage it takes to get out of bed when the light has dimmed in your world. Burt was trying to ground him, to bring him back from the ledge of a public breakdown that would have erased the memory of everything he had built. He saw Johnny's lip begin to tremble, a tiny movement signaling the dam was about to burst, and he knew he had only seconds to act. The air in the studio felt like it was being sucked out, leaving everyone gasping for a sense of normalcy that was rapidly fading. Burt looked at the glass of water sitting on the desk, then back at his friend, realizing the only way to save the man was to shatter the moment. He saw the tears beginning to well up in Johnny's eyes, a sight that would have finished the peace of millions of viewers across the country who weren't prepared for such raw pain. He knew what he had to do, even if it meant becoming the villain of the evening to protect the soul of the man he loved like a brother. The silence that suddenly fell over Studio One was not the comfortable pause of a comic waiting for a punchline. It was the terrifying hush of a man whose heart had finally stopped beating in time with the world around him. Johnny had been trying to share a story about a stray dog he had seen, a simple little tale meant to bridge the gap. But mid-sentence, the words seemed to turn to ash in his mouth, and the king simply stopped. He didn't look at his notes, he didn't look at Ed, and he didn't look at the camera. He stared into the middle distance, as if he were watching the final moments of his own happiness play out on a screen only he could see. His hands began to shake with such violence that he had to tuck them beneath the edge of the mahogany desk. The studio audience sat in a state of frozen confusion, their smiles fading as they realized they were witnessing the shattering of a human being. It was the moment every performer fears, the moment when the wall between private pain and the public persona finally breaks. Johnny's eyes were now swimming in a reservoir of unshed tears, reflecting the tragedy of the news he had received in that private phone call. He was a father who had just been told his child's journey was reaching its end, and the effort of pretending otherwise was taking the spirit right out of him. Burt Reynolds sat less than 3 feet away, watching as his friend's face turned a ghostly, ashen gray. He saw the way Johnny's throat worked as he tried to swallow the sob that would have crushed the spirit of every person watching. If Johnny broke now, the legend of the unflappable Johnny Carson would be spiritually vanished, replaced forever by the image of a man undone by grief. The red light of camera 2 stared at him like a cyclops, indifferent to the fact that the man in its crosshairs was emotionally perishing in front of 20 million souls. The silence stretched for 10 seconds, which in live television feels like an eternity. You could hear the faint hum of the cooling fans and a distant car horn outside. But inside the sanctuary of the show, there was only the sound of a man's spirit breaking. Johnny's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out, only a sharp, pained intake of breath that sounded like a final gasp. He looked at Burt with a silent plea for mercy, his eyes screaming for someone to turn off the lights, to stop the clock, to let him go home and weep for the loss of his world. The tension was a physical cord stretched to its breaking point, vibrating with the energy of a calamity about to unfold. Burt knew the next thing to come out of Johnny's mouth wouldn't be a joke, but a primal cry for help that would change how the world saw him forever. He looked at the glass of ice water, knowing he had to do something so shocking that it would snap the spell of grief before it was too late. In that heartbeat of pure agony, Burt Reynolds didn't hesitate. He seized the glass of ice water, upending it directly over the head of the most powerful man in television. The freezing liquid cascaded over Johnny's suit and splashed across his face, the ice cubes clattering against the mahogany desk like diamonds falling onto a coffin lid. For a split second, the world held its breath. In the wings, the producer grabbed his headset, ready to cut the feed, and Ed McMahon's jaw dropped in horror, thinking a friendship had just ended on live air. A collective gasp echoed from the studio to the millions of sofas as the king sat there, drenched and motionless. To the audience, it was the ultimate prank, a bold act of defiance from the world's biggest movie star. They erupted into a roar of laughter, the tension that had been suffocating the room suddenly snapping and releasing a wave of joyful noise. But underneath the water, something miraculous was happening. The shock of the cold had acted like a physical jolt to Johnny's system, snapping him back from the edge of the emotional abyss where he had been teetering. It was as if Burt had reached into the rising tide of Johnny's shattered heart and pulled him back to the surface, giving him a reason to blink, a reason to move, and a way to hide the tears already beginning to fall. As the water dripped from his nose, Johnny's eyes finally cleared of that haunted look. He saw Burt watching him with an intensity that transcended the laughter of the crowd, a gaze that said, "Stay with me. I have you." Johnny realized the wetness on his cheeks now looked like nothing more than the remnants of a joke, allowing him to weep in plain sight without anyone knowing the devastation that was actually pouring out of his soul. It was a baptism of friendship, a sacrifice of dignity that Burt had made to ensure that Johnny's private calamity remained his own. The water was a shield, a cold armor that protected a father's ailing spirit from the prying eyes of the world. Johnny reached up and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, his shoulders shaking. But to the 20 million people watching, it looked like he was simply laughing at the audacity of his guest. He let out a breath he had been holding since that fateful phone call, a long, shaky exhale that carried away just enough of the pressure to allow his heart to beat again. He looked at Burt and saw the man who had been willing to look like a fool just to save his best friend from perishing under the weight of a secret. The laughter of the audience was no longer a burden. It was a bridge, carrying Johnny back to the land of the living while he navigated the ending of his family's peace. The band began to play a jaunty tune as the show prepared for a commercial break, and for the first time that night, Johnny's smile didn't feel like a mask. He leaned forward, the water still glistening, and looked at Burt with a profound, unspoken gratitude. They had survived the most dangerous minute of Johnny's career, but as the red light on the camera finally flickered off, the reality of what lay ahead began to settle over them both once more. The heavy silence that follows a roar is often the loudest sound in the world, and as the red tally light on the camera finally winked out, the laughter in Studio One vanished. The applause sign went dark, leaving the stage in a muted glow where the only sound was the rhythmic drip of water hitting the floor. For a long, breathless minute, the two icons sat in the shadows of the set, two men stripped of their fame, breathing together in a rhythm that spoke of a shared catastrophe that the world outside could never fathom. Johnny didn't reach for a towel. He simply sat there with his head bowed, the water mixing with the salt of the tears he was finally allowed to flow. He reached across the desk, his fingers searching for Burt's hand, and when he found it, he squeezed with a strength born of pure heartbreak. Burt leaned in, his face etched with a rugged sorrow, and whispered into the quiet that he was sorry he had to do it, but he couldn't watch his brother pass into the darkness. Johnny looked up, his eyes rimmed with red, and whispered back that Burt had saved his soul from perishing in front of millions of strangers. They spoke in hushed, urgent tones as the stagehands moved like ghosts in the background, carefully keeping their distance from the two men locked in a moment of raw, human desolation. Johnny confessed that when he had looked into the lens, all he could see was the face of his son and the ending of all his dreams for the boy's future. He told Burt he felt like a fraud, making the world laugh while his own spirit was being laid to rest by a phone call that had changed his life forever. Burt didn't try to offer a miracle. He just sat there as a witness to the agony, his presence a solid wall against the tide of destruction that was threatening to wash Johnny away. It was the type of conversation that only happens in the deepest part of the night, between two people who have seen the worst that life can offer and decided to face it together. Johnny admitted he had been ready to walk off the stage and never return, to let the curtain fall right then and there because he didn't think a man could be the king of late night and a grieving father at the same time. Burt listened, his eyes glistening with fierce loyalty, and reminded Johnny the people at home needed him to be human, even if they didn't know the specifics of his tragedy. As the floor director began the 30-second countdown, Johnny took a deep, shuddering breath and used a handkerchief to wipe away the evidence. He straightened his tie and looked at Burt with eternal gratitude, knowing the man in the guest chair was the only reason he was still breathing. The music began to swell once more, a bright melody that felt like a sharp contrast to the shattered reality of the last 2 minutes. Johnny knew he had to go back out there and finish the dance, but as he looked toward the dressing room door, he realized the real work was yet to come. The heavy oak door of dressing room. One clicked shut, sealing out the echoes of the studio and leaving the two men in a silence so profound it felt like a weight. Johnny didn't head for the vanity to remove his makeup. Instead, he collapsed into the floral armchair, the dampness of his suit seeping into his very bones. Burt Reynolds followed him inside, ignoring the tray of appetizers on the table, and simply sat on the edge of the ottoman, watching the man who had been the face of American joy, unraveling into pieces. The brightly lit mirrors now showed only a father whose world had been brought to its knees by a reality no amount of fame could fix. Johnny buried his face in his hands, his shoulders heaving in the quiet room as the adrenaline of the broadcast evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hollow misery. He spoke of the call from the specialist, the clinical words that had sounded like the final tolling of a bell for his son's future. Burt sat there, a silent sentinel of friendship, understanding that there are moments when words are useless, and all a man can do is stand guard over his brother's ailing spirit. He watched as Johnny reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled drawing, a child's attempt at a stick-figure family that he had been clutching as a lifeline. As the minutes stretched toward midnight, the two titans were currently just two human beings grappling with the conclusion of a legacy. Johnny confessed he felt as though he were spiritually perishing, unable to find a reason to return to that mahogany desk tomorrow night, when the only person he wanted to make laugh might soon be no longer here. Burt leaned forward, his voice low and steady, and told Johnny the water he had thrown wasn't just a prank. It was a promise that he would never let the shadows swallow his friend. He reached over and took a small notepad from the desk, scribbling 12 words that he then folded and pressed into Johnny's shaking palm. Johnny opened the paper, his eyes blurring as he read the message. "The crown is heavy, but you don't have to carry it alone, brother." It was a simple sentence, but in that moment, it felt like a beacon of light in the middle of a crushing storm. The two men stood up and embraced, a long hold that spoke of a loyalty that would endure long after the cameras were hauled away. Johnny looked at the note one last time before tucking it into his breast pocket, right next to his heart, feeling a tiny spark of warmth begin to thaw the ice of his grief. The night air was cool as they finally prepared to leave the building, the Burbank parking lot mostly empty and the palm trees swaying in a gentle breeze. Johnny stopped at the door, looking back at the darkened hallway of the studio where he had spent so much of his life, wondering if he would ever be the same man again. He knew the road ahead was filled with heart-wrenching endings, but for the first time since that morning, he felt he might have the strength to walk it. For more than 30 years, the footage of the water splashing across Johnny's face became a staple of every highlight reel, a moment frozen in time as the ultimate example of late-night spontaneity. To the world, it was a comedy classic, a hilarious bit of television history that people would point to whenever they spoke about the golden era. But while the audience laughed at the grainy film, the two men at the center of the frame carried a secret that remained untouched by the passing of time. A sacred pact of silence that protected the shattered reality of the night the music almost stopped. Johnny Carson never allowed the writers to turn that incident into a recurring joke, and he never brought it up in interviews, deflecting any questions with a quick wit that acted as a shield for his grieving heart. He kept the damp, stained tie from that broadcast in a special box in his home, not as a souvenir, but as a relic of a moment when his spirit was pulled back from the brink. Every time the anniversary rolled around, Johnny would find himself in his study, staring at the 12-word note Burt had given him, remembering how the cold water had felt like a second chance at life when his own will to continue was fading. The public saw the king growing older with poise, but they never saw the private phone calls that took place at 2 a.m. between Malibu and Florida. Burt Reynolds, too, played his part in the beautiful deception, never once hinting his prank was actually a desperate act of love to save a broken father from a public collapse. He watched from afar as Johnny navigated the heartbreaking departures of his private life. standing by as a silent witness to the strength it took for Johnny to keep the world smiling while his own family faced the end of their joy. They were like two old veterans bound by an invisible cord of loyalty that grew stronger as the decades began to thin the ranks of their peers. When they did appear together in later years, there was a look shared between them, a subtle glance that said the secret was still safe. As the years marched on and the lights of the studio grew dimmer, the water incident remained a mystery wrapped in a laugh. People wondered why the most guarded man in Hollywood had allowed Burt Reynolds to get away with such a move, never realizing the water had been a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. It was a testament to a type of friendship rarely seen in the spotlight, one that is willing to be misunderstood by millions in order to be understood by the one person who truly matters. Johnny knew that without that splash of water, the memory of his career would have been laid to rest under the weight of a tragedy he wasn't ready to share. Even as Johnny entered his final years of seclusion, the gratitude he felt for that night never faded away. He had learned the most important performances of our lives are often the ones no one realizes are a performance at all. He spent his days looking out at the Pacific Ocean, holding on to the memory of a friend who had been brave enough to shatter the silence when the world was watching. When the news finally broke on that cold January morning in 2005 that the king had reached the final horizon of his journey, Burt Reynolds didn't join the throngs of celebrities rushing to microphones to give a practiced eulogy. Instead, he retreated to the quiet sanctuary of his own home, sat by a window, and poured a single glass of ice water as a tribute to a brotherhood that had survived the brightest lights and the darkest tragedies. For Burt, the passing of his friend wasn't just the end of an era. It was the departure of the only man who truly knew what it felt like to stand in the center of a hurricane and try to keep a smile on your face while your heart was being torn asunder. The world remembered Johnny Carson for the thousands of hours of laughter and the legendary cool that defined a generation. But as Burt sat in the silence, he remembered the man who had trembled in a darkened hallway, the father who had held a crumpled drawing like a shield, and the friend who had whispered, "Thank you," through a face drenched in water and tears. He thought about that 12-word note he had written so many years ago, realizing that while the crown had been heavy, they had carried it together until the final moment. It is a rare thing to find a soul willing to help you carry your sorrow when the rest of the world only wants to see your joy. In the days following the conclusion of Johnny's time with us, stories began to surface of his quiet generosity and the anonymous foundations he had started. But the most important story was the one that remained unspoken, the one about a splash of water that had saved a man's spirit from perishing on national television. Johnny lived his final years with a profound sense of peace, knowing his greatest tragedy had been held in the hands of a friend who loved him more than fame. He had learned the most successful man is not the one with the highest ratings, but the one who has someone in his corner who knows exactly when he needs to be doused in the cold reality of love. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows, Burt picked up the glass and felt the chill of the ice against his palm, a sensation that transported him back to 1974 and the smells of stage makeup. He realized then that the water incident wasn't a joke at all. It was a prayer, a baptism, and a promise that had been kept for over 30 years. Johnny had passed away in the physical sense, but the warmth of that connection was a fire that could never be extinguished by time or loss. We all search for that one person who will see us when the mask finally cracks, the one who will throw the water when we are drowning in our own hidden pain. Johnny Carson found that person in Burt Reynolds, and in doing so, he showed us that even the most powerful among us are just human beings longing to be seen, to be helped, and to be loved. We all have those moments where the world expects a smile while our hearts are breaking. Tell us, who is the Burt Reynolds in your life who helped you carry the weight? If this story touched your heart, please consider sharing it with someone who might be carrying a heavy burden in silence today. Sometimes, all it takes to save a shattered spirit is knowing that you don't have to face the darkness alone.